Denying the humanity of others is at the heart of the cancer of hate. Hate that continues to metastasize as spiking antisemitism and racism foment a climate of fear. Today, we welcome a distinguished bipartisan panel to talk about how we can turn down the temperature on the intolerance that's subverting our democracy. Joining us are Juju Chang, Emmy Award-winning co-anchor of ABC News Nightline. Linda Chavez, political commentator and author who served in the Reagan administration. Jonathan Greenblatt, CEO of the Anti-Defamation League. And Mark Morial, president and CEO of the National Urban League. We're grateful to have you all with us. Mark, I'm going to start with you, because I've heard you say that sometimes to get to the sunshine, you got to go through the storm. Has the storm gotten worse?
The storm in America has gotten worse. It is deteriorated by every measure, by every sensibility, by every feeling. Hate crimes are on the rise against every marginalized groups: Blacks, Latinos, Asians, LGBTQ, Muslims. It's painful, it's hurtful that a nation whose power and strength is this great tapestry or gumbo of people somehow seems to be turning on each other, as though there isn't enough here for everyone, as though we can't celebrate the fact that we've got to lift every boat. The idea that America was built by one group versus another grates my soul, because it's inconsistent with not only the facts, but the toil, the work, the suffering, the pain of my ancestors, your ancestors, and every single community, ethnic group, or people who've contributed to the making of this very unique nation. And so I just think that in 21st century America, if we do not embrace this variation, this mosaic, this gumbo, this diversity as a strength, we will unravel as a nation.
Linda, you had an illustrious career you continue to do in public service. You have worked in the areas of racism, immigration, and you were the highest ranking woman, I believe, in the Reagan administration. You worked in the George H.W. Bush administration. And basically, you got to the point where during the Trump administration, you watched as hate crimes and bias crimes and racist slurs increased. And you were, I understand, you were waiting for some uprising, a mass uprising to call that behavior out, which never came. Now, the question is, how did that legacy have a hand in where we are today on this issue?
I think the Trump years were very dark years in American history. And I believe that what we're seeing today is a direct result of some of what happened during those Trump years. We've become much more divided. We are more polarized than any time we have been in history. I'm old enough to have been a student during the Vietnam years. We were polarized then, but it's nothing like what we're seeing today. Now we are seeing people who are divided. They're divided by racial lines. They're divided by partisan lines. We have become very, very tribal. Instead of identifying as Americans and understanding that we may differ politically, we may have different ideologies, we may differ on public policy, but we are still Americans, and what we want is what is good for the whole country. That, I think, has disappeared. And I think a lot of this was driven by the kind of racial politics that Donald Trump promoted in his campaign, which was launched with an attack on Hispanics and immigrants in general. A lot of people remember it as an attack on illegal immigration. He was opposed to legal immigration as well as illegal immigration. And I think he divided the country. He made people feel fearful of each other and to have contempt for each other. And I think, unfortunately, that has now taken root in parts of America and is a very, very dangerous time that we live in, particularly as we go into an election year. We are going to see this year an increase in that kind of polarization. And I fear for the country. I fear for our future. I fear for our democracy, because at stake, we are such a divided country right now that I hope that we're going to survive as the democratic country, that small d democratic country that we've been in the past.
Juju, you've had a storied career as an award-winning journalist, and I've heard you say something that intrigued me, which was that your storytelling is informed by your younger self, 4-year-old girl who came from Korea with her family to the United States. And during the pandemic, you covered horrific crimes that erupted out of anti-Asian sentiment, including a mass murder in Atlanta that killed 8 people, including 6 women of Asian descent. I can't imagine, coming from your background, I know you're a journalist, I get that, but how was that? How tough was that?
Well, Jane, every time you cover a mass shooting, it's a tragic event. And as a journalist, you always compartmentalize, right? But when the attack seems to be directed at a community with which you identify, it hits in a different way. And I think I've spent, decades in my career covering mass shootings and all sorts of tragedies. And we had just come off of this horrific spike in anti-AAPI hate. And we saw that so much of the fear and the anxiety around COVID was weaponized against the Asian American community. And it's something that I think inspired me to be the journalist that I am, because when I was young, as you mentioned, I came to this country at the age of 4. I am a proud immigrant and a proud daughter of immigrants. And I remember watching my dad be treated badly, in today's modern parlance, dehumanized or be the subject of microaggression. I didn't even know what I was witnessing. I didn't have words to describe it. But as I became an adult, as I became a journalist, as I saw other marginalized communities treated badly, I began to connect the dots. So throughout my career, I've done stories about the LGBTQ plus community, the African-American community, the Hispanic community, migrants. This is a whole area of reporting that really just I lead with my heart. And so going to a mass shooting that was targeting and dehumanizing Asian Americans and Asian American women specifically, and sort of doubling down on all of the horrible tropes against our community, was particularly heart-stopping, and it took a while for me to metabolize it all.
Jonathan, I should point out that the phrase I used at the top of the show, to deny people their humanity, is at the core of hatred. And I heard that from you, actually. And I want to ask you, as the grandson of a Holocaust survivor whose wife fled her native Iran because of anti-Semitism, you are on a mission to preserve and protect the rights of all. But it's more than a mission for you. It's a value that I think, again, you said is seared into your soul. Now, before October 7th, when Israel was attacked, anti-Semitism was already on the ascent. And since then, we've seen a massive new, wave of attacks globally that's rocked the world. How do you characterize where we are right now?
Well, it's a good question, and I'll just start out by saying how much I appreciate the opportunity to be on the show. It's nice, in particular, to be here with Mark and Juju, who are longtime friends, who I've been honored to work with on multiple occasions, and I've known them for years. I think we are in a challenging and, if you will, an unprecedented moment. So just stepping back, the ADL is the oldest anti-hate organization in America. We've been at this work of fighting anti-Jewish hate and all forms of bigotry for more than 100 years. Literally, since 1913, we've been combating anti-Semitism in all its forms, as well as fighting anti-Black racism, anti-Asian hate, and on and on. And yet, right here and right now, we're confronting a situation we've just never seen before. Over the last decade, anti-Semitic incidents have risen more than 500% in America. I'm talking about acts of harassment, vandalism, and violence. And we know this because ADL tracks hate crimes and bias incidents of the likes I'm describing. We've been doing it since the 1970s. And in 2022, we saw the highest number of incidents we have ever counted. This is beyond alarming. I mean, this is literally life-threatening. And then in 2023, prior to October the 7th, we were seeing incidents at roughly the same level as the prior year. So we already were incredibly worried. And then after October 7th, there has been a tsunami of hate. Literally, October 7th was the bloodiest day for the Jewish people since the Holocaust. More than 1,200 people were butchered, tortured, raped, murdered. I mean, the stories are grotesque. And yet somehow, on that day, rather than generating worldwide empathy, and though that did come from many quarters, let me be clear, it also sparked a worldwide explosion of hate. In the last 90 plus days, we have tracked a 330% increase in anti-Jewish acts over the same period of time last year. This is an alarming, appalling, and moment of urgent concern for me as the head of ADL and the son of a Holocaust survivor, and for Jewish people across America and really around the world.
Mark, I think the last equality index that the Urban League did showed that African Americans in this country are only doing about 74% as well as white Americans. And what a lot of people don't understand is that this also undermines the democracy that we're living in. This is a threat to everyone's equality. Explain that to people.
So the equality index is very simple, and it is a measure of social and economic statistics or status. We compare blacks to whites and blacks and whites to Latinos. And on the measuring stick, so what do we look at? Unemployment rates, life expectancy rates, high school graduation rates, home ownership rates, business formation rates, wealth rates. When you take it all together, African Americans are indexing at about 73.4% of where white Americans are. Latinos are indexing at maybe 78% of where white Americans are. This is the status from a social and economic standpoint. We can get into a long discussion about why these disparities exist. They have their roots in a long history of this nation, in denial and segregation and enslavement. And has the nation made progress since 1963 and 64? Yes, we have. Does the nation have tremendous amount more work to be done? Yes, the nation does. And to level that playing field is in the best interest of every single American and Americans not yet born.
Linda, I want to ask about a transition you made, which was people who know that you're a passionate conservative and have, stood for those values for many years, might be surprised to find out that you started out, I was surprised to find out, as somebody who worked with, union leaders, and you worked at the DNC, and you worked with, you were part of a socialist group. You were in a very different environment before you made this switch out of that world. And my question to you is, what was appealing about the conservative construct that you felt you didn't have when you were in a more, I guess, for lack of a better word, liberal setting?
When I became a Republican, actually during the Reagan years, the party was one that believed in individual rights, believed in the idea of America as a immigrant-friendly country and a nation that was made up of people of many, many different backgrounds. I think what we're missing today and what we're seeing today is that the conservative movement has so bought into the whole identity politics. And unfortunately, that identity politics includes a racial identity as well as a partisan identity. And I think that's very dangerous. It's very bad. I think that as a country, as a multiracial, multi-ethnic country, what works best is when we think of ourselves as individuals. And what we share in common is what makes us Americans. You know what's interesting about my transition from liberal to conservative, from active Democrat to one of the highest ranking Hispanics in the country in the Reagan administration, is that my views didn't really change. What changed is the parties changed. And I think in the 1970s in particular, the Democratic Party moved left. They moved away from the idea of civil rights as I believed in it, as a matter of individual rights and honoring what Martin Luther King said at the Lincoln Memorial, that people should be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And I found that as the liberals moved away from that and moved towards thinking of people in terms of what group they belonged to, so that people were not treated as individuals, but part of ethnic and political groups, that turned me off. And what I found was that the conservatives during the Reagan years had much more emphasis on individual rights, making sure that people believed that they were part of something bigger, and that what was important was what we have in common. So that transition was not so much because I changed. I think it was largely driven by the change in the parties and what they came to represent. Unfortunately, what we're seeing today is that the right is now embracing that kind of groupthink. They want to divide people by race. They want to divide people by partisan labels. And that's what has turned me off and ultimately has driven me from the Republican Party. I no longer feel that I can be part of the Trump-led Republican Party. And so now I'm an independent.
Juju, we're all talking, we come from different perspectives. This is personal, clearly, for all of you. It should be personal, actually, for everyone. But the point is, we're talking about a culture of hatred. And one of the things I've heard you talk about, Juju, is the stereotypes that get in the way all the time of how people make presumptions and assumptions about Asian Americans. And there's this, for example, this notion that Asian Americans are the model minority. And from your perspective and from your activity and what you've done, the work you've done, it's anything but true. Explain that.
Well, I think each minority community, each often marginalized community, is the subject of certain prejudices, how we prejudge a group of people. And especially when it is often perceived as a positive, stereotype, we're like, what's wrong with that? Men find Asian American women attractive. Well, the flip side of that is that Asian American women are fetishized and dehumanized, right? The same thing goes with the so-called model minority. Well, you're all crazy rich Asians. You all go off to Ivy League schools. And the truth is, there is a grain of truth in that. There are high-achieving Asian Americans, but there are also high-achieving African Americans and Hispanic Americans. You don't turn that into a full-blown prejudice against, or a reputational trope against a group of people. And I think the backfiring of that particular so-called model minority myth is that it renders the rest of the community invisible, because in many ways what is unseen is the poverty, the folks in the undocumented recent immigrants or migrants who are suffering in silence. They are living in grinding poverty. I've worked with community organizations in the greater New York area that target the Asian American community because their poverty levels are higher than African American and Hispanic communities in New York. And most people wouldn't know that. And at the same time, the amount of federal, state, and city aid directed at Asian Americans is a pittance compared to the need. And then in addition to that, certain communities are pitted against others. You know, why can't you be as successful as the Asian American community? Well, the Asian American community isn't as successful as this trope would suggest. And so it pits communities of color against each other. And I think it is damaging in that way. And that doesn't even begin to touch the mental health crises that exist when every Asian American kid is expected to be a straight A student and a perfect student. And that just is not human.
Mark, Professor Elijah Anderson at Yale talks about the fact that there's never been a moment of significant advancement for African Americans that hasn't been followed by some sort of backlash. The obvious example is the election of the first African American president, Barack Obama, which was followed by a resurgence of, again, hatred and all kinds of bias and discrimination. That cycle, I mean, is there any way that you're obviously aware of that. Is there any way to get past that cycle, or is that,
Well,
yeah?
it's, I want to say I hope so. I want to say I'll work for it, but we're witnessing it once again. We had this incredible awakening with the murder of George Floyd, with commitments and expressions of solidarity and people protesting all over the world. Corporations made commitments, foundations made commitments, governments made commitments. Yet 4 years later, we see corporations retrenching. We see some corporations even refusing to respond to requests for a status report on the commitments that they made. This is disappointing. This is something that is angering. This is something that breeds cynicism and distrust. Professor Anderson is absolutely correct. We see steps forward and steps back. The only way we get beyond it is with courageous leadership. The only way we get beyond it is with principled leaders who are willing to take some heat, willing to stand up for what they know is right, and who are willing to follow through on their commitments. George Wallace, who ran as a segregationist candidate in 1968, got just enough votes to tip the election from Humphrey to Nixon, a very, very close election. And his candidacy was in effect, I think, one of the low moments in American history because he ran on racial division. He ran on his reputation as the governor who blocked the entrance to the schoolhouse door to prevent black children from integrating the schools in Alabama. That's what he ran on. But we see in the Wallace candidacy the seeds of the 2016 Trump candidacy. It's stunning, the through line in terms of the elevation of fear and division, invective, and mischaracterization and personal attacks designed to elevate fear and elevate passion in one's supporters. So it was an interesting time in American history. Many people have forgotten about the Wallace candidacy and how impactful it was on the 1968 election. Civics education should be mandatory and foundational for every student in America.
I can just jump in on what Mark is saying and double down on this idea that really we need to educate our children, and it's incumbent on the adults in the room to really give them the foundation for critical thinking. It is the way that we arm people against disinformation. It's the way you arm your young person against to use critical thinking. I mean, I've done all these stories at ABC News about how the average age a child is exposed to porn is 12. There aren't enough settings on a phone to keep my 3 now teenage sons away from those things. Instead, what you do is you arm them with critical thinking and with an understanding of all these issues. And I think, truly, and everybody you talk to when it comes to fighting hate points to education.
Linda, in terms of the Hispanic community, back in 2009, you wrote a book called Out of the Barrio. And you really shook a lot of people up. It stirred up a lot of controversy because you basically said that, Latinos were not necessarily the permanent underclass, and that they were doing pretty well and they aspired to the American dream, and things were on the up and up. Now, I think at this point in time, we're looking at over 63 million Hispanics in this country, constituting the largest minority in America. And yet, hate crimes, as was said earlier, against Latinos still proliferating. How do you assess where that particular population is at this point?
So there has been enormous change in the Hispanic community. At the time that I wrote my book, which is now more than 30 years ago, the first edition, there was a very large native-born population and an incoming and growing immigrant population. And one of the points of Out of the Barrio was to note that Hispanics, unlike African Americans or the indigenous population in the United States, were largely an immigrant group. But Hispanics have followed in the path of most immigrant groups. They come in often with low skills, with poverty, not a lot of education, but within 1 to 2 generations, they move into the middle class. And what's happened to Hispanics is there's a very large intermarriage rate among Hispanics, and some of the most successful Hispanics actually disappear from our statistics. We have a very large immigrant population, and sadly, many of the people who are coming now are undocumented. And that's going to have a big impact on how they succeed in the United States. And I think that immigrant backlash, which was the name of one of the chapters in my book, is responsible for a lot of the prejudice that is directed and the discrimination that is directed against Hispanics today. But I'm quite confident that even the most recent arrivals, people from Mexico, Central America, Venezuela, South America, the Caribbean, will do as their predecessors did. They'll learn English, they'll become more educated, and they will move up the economic ladder. And all of the research that I've done over the years suggests that that is happening. The motto, founding motto of this country, which is out of many, one, e pluribus unum. That is what binds us as a nation. And I fear that what we've seen lately, and it has accelerated in the last few years, is this dividing ourselves and identifying first and foremost with whatever group we came from. The group we ought to identify with is America.
Well, I will, at this point, go to Jonathan, because back in 1935, and Sinclair Lewis is not around, I think it was 1935, but Sinclair Lewis wrote a book called It Can't Happen Here, which was about a populist who was elected president and then imposed some sort of fascism on the United States. You wrote a book last year called It Can Happen Here. And so, Jonathan, what is the correlation about how racism tees up authoritarianism, or can tee it up?
Look, I'd like to build on what Linda was just saying. I mean, think about this idea of e pluribus unum, this notion about the strength of our country coming from its diversity and its difference and its richness. I mean, we've come a very long way. Think about where we were 100 years ago. African Americans couldn't vote. We had an incredibly monolithic culture. We didn't have the kind of immigration that we have now. And yet, 100 years since that time, we have had an African American president. We are now living through a time with the first female vice president, who, by the way, is the daughter of an immigrant from South Asia, and so herself is of Asian American and African American descent. And I would argue that America is the most diverse, heterodox democracy and the most successful such society in the history of humanity. It is remarkable how far we've come, but that doesn't change the fact that, of course, we still have a long way to go. Whether it is, as we've been talking about, the rise of anti-Semitism, whether it's the pernicious nature of other forms of racism and prejudice, we are still confronted with a very complex environment. So it's going to take all of us, from elected officials to ordinary citizens, to address these issues, to make America live up to the, if you will, the ambition of e pluribus unum. But I do think it's fair to say that, again, we're living in a moment where it seems to be cynicism seems to be the single most shared value in America, and conspiracies are the coin of the realm. So there is this general, I think, distrust of institutions. And I think it's reached a nadir. I mean, distrust of universities, of media, of government, of law enforcement, of the judiciary, of business. It is really, really bad. And in this moment where systems seem to fail and cynicism is so high, that often creates an environment where populists can emerge. Populists who, are not interested in the complexity of problems and the layered nature of difficult issues. Instead, they look for silver bullets. And typically, the single most common silver bullet is the scapegoat, looking for someone to blame. And I believe in large part that's why anti-Semitism has skyrocketed. Again, whether it's individuals on the far right or those on the hard left, white supremacists or hardened anti-Zionists, this notion that you can, quote unquote, sort of blame the Jews or the Jewish lobby or Jewish donors or the Jewish state, on and on. These are symptomatic of, I think, deep societal dysfunction and this desire, again, to find the easy way out by looking for someone to blame rather than dealing with the really difficult issues that are at the root of the problem in the first place. I love the fact that my friend Mark has that pillow behind him that says Gumbo Coalition. Now, as the former mayor of New Orleans, maybe we shouldn't be surprised that he is talking about gumbo, but from my mind, what I love about it is gumbo is this stew that is so rich and filled with flavor, with so many different but also distinct ingredients. And that is really what America is all about in many ways.
Well, I was going to say, Jonathan actually almost kicked off. We're going to have a little video gumboism right now. I think you should maybe patent that, trademark that word. But to kick off our block on what we can do, more of the solutions to fulfill our moral obligation to call out hate and take action against racism, we're going to start with a trailer from the HBO Max documentary Gumbo Coalition, which focuses on Mark's fight and others for racial equality.
You do not want to be the generation that allows progress to slip.
We understood the importance of working across communities.
The Gumbo Coalition, which include Black and white, Hispanic and Asian and straight and gay.
We have to meet the moment. We have to fight back.
And fighting back is something that is happening now in the wake of a Supreme Court decision that ended race-based affirmative action, college admissions. Mark, the fact is that most Americans are in favor of equality. But when you factor in something like affirmative action, 69% of Americans thought the Supreme Court got it right with that decision. They don't want to see preferential treatment at the expense of somebody else. So how do you address that?
I think that the notion that affirmative action is about preferential treatment, and that 70% of people understand it that way, is the result of a 50-year campaign that's been run by conservatives to describe affirmative action in that fashion. The city I grew up in, I said there was a 100% quota. That quota was 100% of all elected officials, judges, bankers, business owners were white men. 100% of all legislators, of all coroners, 100% for the most part of all doctors were white men. When one seeks to dismantle a quota, it is not a preference program. When one seeks to level the playing field by creating opportunity, it is not a preference program. So while I understand why people might understand it that way, I think when people understand the specifics of what these leveling the playing field programs are all about, they generally support them, and they generally support the idea. So to some extent, the Supreme Court decision was more of a political decision than a correct interpretation of the Constitution.
Now, I want to turn to Linda at this point because, Linda, you've never been a fan of affirmative action.
I've never been a fan of affirmative action, primarily because I don't think it benefits the people that it's intended to help. I think Black and Hispanic students have actually been harmed by being admitted to colleges where they were not well prepared to be able to succeed. And in fact, after California banned racial preferences in the college admissions, there was a drop in Black and Hispanic admissions to the top tier schools in the University of California system. But there was an expansion of those students into the middle range of those schools. And because the students were being admitted to the schools with similar preparation, similar test scores, similar grades to their white peers, those Black and Hispanic students actually graduated. I've been involved for years in studying the effects of affirmative action. And it's easy for schools to say, we're going to give you a chance to attend the school, even though your grades and your test scores show that you are well below the median student that we admit. But what they can't do is to ensure that you're actually going to graduate. And what the Center for Equal Opportunity, which I chair, has found over the years in our various studies is that students don't graduate when they don't have the proper preparation. And it is far better for students to have a 4-year degree from a school like University of California, Riverside, than to spend a year or two at Berkeley and end up dropping out. So I think that affirmative action actually has not helped those it was intended to. And I'm hopeful that with the Supreme Court decision, we're going to see actually more Black and Hispanic students graduating from college, doing so on their own steam, being able to compete on an equal footing. And I think that's going to be great for those Black and Hispanic students.
I mean, there are many people who make the case that affirmative action has done nothing but good for minorities. If not affirmative action, what's the alternative?
I think if you want to do it right, what you need to do is to prepare students. That might mean that instead of a 4-year program, some students are going to need a 5-year program. They're going to need help when they're in high school. I would much rather see some of our top tier schools mentoring students when they are in high school. I'd like to see more outreach, more tutoring programs, more summer programs that can give kids the ability to be able to learn those skills that are going to help them succeed. You can do the same thing in business with affirmative action. The end of race-based admissions, the end of race-based promotions is going to be a good thing for Black and Hispanics in the United States.
Juju, at this point, I do want to turn to some of the things that could be done to try and, as we said at the top of the show, turn down the temperature on intolerance. I go back to the story about your father, because I was very touched by that, how you as a child watched your father being talked down to, being treated differently, and it made you, it obviously sensitized you in terms of being able to spot the casting someone as the otherization of people, which is just epidemic in this country, unfortunately. How do you tell people they can become more sensitized to unconscious bias and discrimination?
Boy, if only I had a magic wand. I think I try to do it with a smile on my face because I actually don't like the term microaggression because I think it assumes that somebody's trying to be aggressive. And really what they're doing is they're exposing an unconscious bias, right? So when somebody over the course of my life, so many countless times have said to me, "Oh, where are you from?" You know, meaning that you don't look like you're from here, you're not American looking, or, oh, you speak English really well. I just sort of let it sit. And I've come up with a funny reply, which is, thank you, so do you. Because it really sort of gently lets them in on their unconscious bias that because I have an Asian face, you assume that I wouldn't speak English well, right? And what does that say about your frame of reference? I think it's really important for us to come at it with a place of understanding that we are all trying to learn and that we're all trying to get better. And, you know, I referred to my dad who was the subject of discrimination, but I think it's worth noting that he was also deeply anti-Semitic. And now, mind you, I married a nice Jewish boy, so this became a little bit of an issue. But again, I laugh because it was really about educating him, right? And disentangling some of his programming that he had had as a young man, and also some of his unconscious biases that he didn't even realize he had. And also understanding that this is sort of human behavior. We categorize and come up with ways in which we think about things and people. And so it's really a nice way of creating the pathways to understanding. You know, I have a nice Jewish husband. I'm raising 3 nice Jewish men who also identify strongly as Asian Americans. And therein lies the future, is to really gently examine each of our unconscious biases, forgive each other for them, but also clean up our own house and admit to our own unconscious biases at the same time.
Jonathan, what do you say to that?
I love my friend Juju's story because I think in so many ways it exemplifies the diversity of our own Jewish community and the different experiences. I mean, look, Jews themselves are a multi-ethnic, multiracial, multi-denominational community. There are highly observant Jews and cultural Jews of no degree of observance at all. There are African American Jews and Latino Jews and Asian American Jews working right here within ADL. My own staff represents this richness, this diversity, this extraordinarily interesting and complex heritage. And I think Juju's story, in many ways, is something I've heard in different forms before. I mean, what it means to raise Jewish children who are biracial or Jewish children who are multi-ethnic is an interesting challenge that I don't know if it's new in the Jewish experience, but it is something that is so quintessentially American. I love that. And I appreciate Juju and what she has done, not just in her profession, and she is an accomplished award-winning journalist, but what she's talked about here and done as a parent and as a mom and as a person, coming to terms with the diversity of her own family and her own personal story is a really amazing one.
At this point, Linda, I want to ask you about the fact you were married in a synagogue. Here's another maybe little known fact about Linda Chavez. Married in a synagogue, and you have three sons. You have 9 grandchildren. At one point, you were talking about the fact that given that so many conservative ethnicities like Hispanics do espouse some of the same values and beliefs that conservatives do, you had hope that maybe they would gravitate toward the Republican Party and that one day the Republican Party would be this bastion of multiracial, working class party. Now, by the time your grandchildren have families of their own, do you think that could happen?
I do think it can happen. And in fact, I think that what you're seeing in terms of the voting behavior, particularly among Hispanics, is that there is a gravitation towards more conservative positions on issues. It really goes back a very long time. Richard Nixon actually got about a third of Mexican American votes in the 1970s, and I think in his 1972 election. And I think that you're seeing more and more Hispanics identifying as they move up the economic ladder. So I think that you're going to see that. And by the way, in terms of my grandchildren, my family is like the melting pot. Yes, my husband is Jewish. I have 3 sons, 9 grandchildren, and they range from blue-eyed redheads to dark-haired brunettes with dark eyes. One of my sons married a woman whose mother was born in Ecuador, her father was born in Cuba. And so, we think of the melting pot, and in fact, I think that melting pot still exists.
Jonathan, as we said earlier, your wife Marjan escaped Iran anti-Semitism. You have 3 children. And you talk about living with, and I want to get this right, this pernicious force, the longest hatred. How, and others do as well. So what's your counsel to them?
My wife, Marjan, came to the United States as a political refugee. She fled Iran because as a Jewish girl, it was very unsafe after the Islamic Revolution. And so my own kids have this sense of mixed identity. They are both, ethnically Ashkenazi and ethnically Iranian. And they have this multicultural framework that, again, much like Juju's children, I think is quintessentially American. And I want my children to realize that, again, their Jewish identity is fundamental to who they are. Again, it transcends culture. It has endured for millennia. And despite the hardships, again, the Jewish people persevere, and they don't just survive, they thrive. And yet, we're also American. And what it means to be engaged and active citizens participating in this great experiment of democracy that we call America is an extraordinary responsibility too. So I tell my kids, and I hope not just in word, but in deed, what it means to live a full life as an American, as a Jewish person. And I hope that they will take the best of those identities and bring that to their lives and eventually give that to their children, God willing, every single day.
Mark, before we do a silver lining on this show, we try to wrap things up with a note of optimism. But first, we have a moment of Zen, courtesy of some students that you met in St. Augustine, Florida, who were part of the documentary Gumbo Coalition, seen on HBO Max. Let's watch.
How many of you think racism is on the rise? How many of you think racism is going away?
I do believe we have a political problem, but the only way to fix the problem is if we get out and vote. We need more people to actually vote than we do now.
I'll challenge you all to make your voices heard, make your voices loud.
Can we clone that? Clone those kids? So this is what most people at the end of this broadcast come back to. They come back to young people. Bless their hearts, they don't really vote in the numbers they should. But the point is, they have the right idea. What are you starting to what are you seeing in terms of young people and the commitment to vote?
Those boys, students at St. Augustine High School, which is an all-boys, all-black Catholic high school in New Orleans, are very special. And they're special because the faculty and the staff there truly, truly nurture them in values, nurture them in knowledge. And it was so, so powerful to see how well-versed they were, how well read they were, how well spoken they were. It did not surprise me, but it excited me because I think that in every community in America, if sometimes, somehow, we would just listen more to our young people, we might learn something. They are seeing the same news we see. They have access to the same online information. They're living in the same world we're living in. And they have perspectives and they have insight. Not that it's right, not that it's all perfect, not that they have all the answers, but maybe we ought to listen more.
Juju, before I'm going to give you the last word, I just have to ask you one thing that your mother allegedly did that I read about, which was you wanted to be an engineer. Is it true that she actually saw, legendary broadcaster Connie Chung at one point and suggested that maybe you might want to switch and follow in her footsteps?
I think my parents were well-meaning, but perhaps a little misguided in expecting me to be an engineer, like a lot of good Asian American children were doing. And I wanted to try to fulfill their wishes, but I basically got a 27 out of 100 on my first calculus midterm. But at the same time, I took a mandatory political science class, and lo and behold, I got an A+. And it was the first time in my life where I felt like the clouds parted and the sun shined, and I knew kind of what direction I wanted to go, but I was still lost. And it was my mom who said, that Connie Chung, she's a broadcaster and she talks about current affairs. And basically she also said, you talk a lot, you're, whatever. And so she was my North Star. And I became friends with Connie later, and I told her just how much she meant to me. And she knows. There's been a recent article about how so many young Asian American women are named Connie for that very reason. But she left a huge impression on so many women of my generation. And again, that's why representation matters.
My last question to you. You've spoken about your three sons. You clearly raise them to have pride in their identities and who they are. But I do have to ask you, I think about the 4-year-old girl who came from Korea, South Korea, and they're living with the specter that you lived with as a child. And I want to ask not what advice you necessarily gave them, but how are they coping? How do they do?
It's a really good question. It's not dissimilar to what Jonathan was saying. It is about having pride in your identity, but also knowing when to display that pride. I've one son in college, one son in high school, one who's graduated college, and all three of them wear like either a Jewish star or a Hamza. And in the wake of all of this turmoil, especially with protests on campus and a lot of divisiveness, I've talked to them about like, well, how do you feel about wearing the Star of David? And before I could even finish the sentence, they're like, well, I'm not taking it off. And I'm like, okay, because they want to feel pride in their identity, and they also don't want to have to hide that. But at the same time, I've said to them, look, if you're entering a situation that feels hostile, you grew up in New York City, you have to understand situational awareness. What we need to do is work fervently, as we were talking about in this entire conversation, to build a gumbo coalition, to really understand that we have far more in common than we have differences, that working together in solidarity is the other key to trying to fight hate. Because at the end of the day, what has happened to each of our communities in the ways that we've been marginalized, there are very similar patterns. And until we recognize those patterns and link arms together to fight the hate, it's going to be a long time coming. So I'm optimistic that we can raise consciousness and raise people's awareness to the way answers work in the face of hate.
We are now officially out of time, but I just want to say I can't think of 4 better folks to have been part of this, who have been candid and coined gumboism and talked about Connie Chung and all different kinds of things. But your humanity no one can deny. So we thank you so much for joining us. And at this point, we do have the silver lining because the students we saw in the Gumbo Coalition clip weren't the only ones to heed Mark's call to make their voices heard. Thousands of students across Florida took a stand for diversity and inclusion in the classroom. To protest the state government trying to control what books they read and how history is taught, they walked off their college campuses. As one student said, like every generation, we need to stand up for the civil rights that have been fought for, the ones that have been won, and the ones that are at stake right now. Finally, meet 21-year-old Mason Morial, who's following in his proud father Mark Morial's footsteps. A junior at the University of Pennsylvania, not only is he a basketball star, he's also an activist leading protests against unfair labor practices suffered by employees at the dining hall of his college. Go, go, Mason. We are grateful to our extraordinary guests for their insights and inspiration, and of course to you for joining us today. Until we see you back here next time from the Frederick Gunn School in the other Washington, Connecticut, for Common Ground, I'm Jane Whitney. Take care.